Welcome everybody to CryptoBeast episode 15, a very special episode today, and it's part one of a multi-part series. We're not really sure how long this is going to go for, but we have a genuine counterculture whistleblower who has been participating in many of the most famous countercultural events of our times since the 1960s and even earlier. Carl Hassell, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm not the counterculture figure.
we're also joined once again by the great Joe Atwill. Welcome again, Joe.
It's great to be here. Hi, Carl.
Good evening.
So Carl has been very involved in the Peyote movement, and it's the technical name is the Peyote Way Church. Is that right, Carl?
Yes, it's the Peyote Way Church of God. It was. I'm not part of that anymore since 2016.
And you're going to share some insight for us. You've titled the series Mana, the Man and the Mystery.
Yeah, it was quite a surprise for me, too.
Yeah, so tell us, who is Mana?
Well, I joined the Peyote Way Church in 1998 because it was a quasi-legal way to take psychedelic drug called peyote. I was a member from 1998 to 2016. And around 2014, I was reading a book called Final Judgment by Michael Collins Piper. And I came across the name Immanuel Trujillo. And I went, what is this all about? So I typed in Immanuel Trujillo, and that basically started me on a multiple-month reading spree. And what really was an eye-opener was I was specifically told by one of the co-founders that, you know, Carl, I've searched Mana. There's nothing on the web. He's a ghost. There's just nothing there. And being a trusting guy, I always tended to think that people had the same insights and the same attitudes I did. So I didn't bother checking on anything. And then, like I said, I came across that name in Final Judgment and just blew my mind. And I found out that Immanuel Trujillo probably is not even a war hero or half Apache, and he's most likely not half Jewish. And he has a huge history in the 1950s with a lot of neo-Nazi groups and rightist groups and the ADL, the FBI, and the non-sectarian anti-Nazi League. Basically was a shit disturber, fomenting riots and producing massive amounts of anti-Semitic literature and sending them all over the world and becoming involved with rightist leaders to support the National Renaissance Party by James Madoll and Fred Weiss. It turned out he was an infiltrator. He infiltrated the NRP in 1952 and basically took it over with a woman named Irene Duval, who went by the name of Ruth Roth. And together,
just let me interrupt you for 1 second there, Carl. What's the NRP?
The NRP is the National Renaissance Party. It was a rightist group formed by James Madoll and Fred Weiss in the early 50s. And they basically just did a lot of screaming and hollering about rightist causes on the street corners of New York. As it turns out, in the 1950s, Immanuel went under the name of Mana Trujillo, and he was possibly a triple agent. He was being financed by a French super spy named Sanford Griffith, and he was also being financed by James Sheldon from the ADL and the non-sectarian anti-Nazi League. They were paying for his mimeograph machine, his rent, his expenses. They got him a brand new motorcycle and some boots.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but you're saying that the ADL was funding him to disseminate anti-Semitic literature?
Yes. And there's plenty of evidence for this. I've shared a lot of links and attachments with you. And reading through the FBI files, we come to find that he was supposed to go on a trip through the Southeast to develop gun connections and foment riots on college campuses to basically, to foment anti-Semitic riots and bitch about whatever the cause was at the time with education. What happened was he never did take his trip throughout the South, because he broke his leg in a motorcycle accident, and that put a whole halt on that. And allegedly, he was supposed to go to Germany and spend some time there after his trip through the Southwest. He was quite the busy guy. It appears he was selling information not only to the ADL, but the FBI. And as we find out, he was a star witness in the second trial of Mickey Jelke, and he ended up taping his apartment. He had it wired for sound and was taping everything that was going on in there and used it as they were using it as testimony.
Right, so that's the same modus operandi that we saw the CIA using in San Francisco, in Greenwich Village, in Operation Midnight Climax, where they would have some luxury apartment close to the city, and they would have prostitutes meeting men in bars and luring them back to this apartment, dosing them with LSD, and then filming them in compromising situations. So this was going on with Mana Trujillo being funded by the ADL. Now, at what point did he begin the church, the Peyote Way Church of God?
That didn't start until 1977, but what I wanted to get into a little bit in the 50s, he was actually busted several times, and the FBI raided his apartment. One week he would have a picture of Stalin with communist literature on the wall, and 2 weeks later he would have a framed picture of Hitler with National Socialist propaganda, and he had constantly had young girls as young as what was described as younger than 14 running around his apartment in various stages of undress and complete nudity. And it was to draw the men and boys in so they could hear the propaganda. And he did get busted for prostitution. And when the FBI raided his apartment when he wasn't there, they found all kinds of German guns and weapons and National Socialist propaganda. And he pretty much got away with all of these different busts and raids until he was arrested in late 1955 or early 56 on a cannabis charge and did almost 2 years in a Canadian prison. And then we don't hear of him again until 1959, when all of a sudden he's an Indian artist.
Right. So where did this guy grow up? And do you know much about his early background?
We only know what he has said in this book here from 1955. It's called I Love You, I Hate You, My 6 Weeks of Free Love with Pat Ward. There's a section called About the Author, which I also shared. I know you have all those links. And he never mentions in the About the Author section that he was an artist, a painter, a potter. Never mentioned that he had his own business. And he was supposed to be a war hero that has a plate in his head. His face was rebuilt. His rib cage was rewired. He had a hole in his leg. It doesn't say any of this in the About the Author section of his book. And as a matter of fact, the tale in the book completely contradicts the entire official narrative that Peyote Way has laid out since 1977. He actually started the church in 1970 under a different name. It was Project Open Hand and Church of the Holy Light. Now, Billy Hitchcock and Timothy Leary were running around with him and actually purchased 3 properties. And Leary eventually went south to Mexico, and Mana stayed in Arizona and started an ashram with the name Bill Haynes, the psychedelic yoga master. And some of the early pottery actually says ashrama. That was the name of the company before he started what allegedly they say is 1948 Mana Pottery. But that cannot be true based on the FBI information and his book and all the other crap that we know. When you put it together, it's absolutely impossible, the official narrative that has been laid out. So,
okay, can I just pause you for a second there again,
please.
Carl? So Billy Hitchcock is Billy Mellon Hitchcock,
Yes.
connected to the Mellon banking family, and his sister as well, Peggy Mellon Hitchcock. They were the owners of the Millbrook estate, where Timothy Leary, once he got kicked out of Harvard, he basically set up this cult in a luxury billionaire castle, remote parts, not quite wilderness, but certainly out in the woods and away from prying eyes, where they could take LSD whenever they wanted. So you're saying that both Leary and Billy Mellon Hitchcock funded Mana Trujillo to set up 3 properties in Arizona?
according to the book called Tripping, yes. And curious, when Millbrook was raided, everybody was busted but Manna. They left the crazy Indian alone. He was in the front house with his pottery studio, so everybody gets popped but him. Again, it's
Right,
kind of
interesting.
a funny story with this guy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's usually a sign of an FBI informant, isn't it? And there's a lot of information to suggest that that Leary may have had to do some things like that as well. And also a thing for the audience about peyote, just to kind of connect everything together, is in some ways it's sort of the original drug. Aleister Crowley did it. Aldous Huxley was the first thing that he was dosed with psychedelically, I believe. Is there anything else you could tell us about, peyote itself and sort of place it into context?
My first peyote was in 1975 for my 18th birthday in Austin, Texas. So I had already been very familiar with it through the entire 1970s, from 1975 to 1979, with a lot of my Native American friends from the Havasupai tribe and friends that worked in the Forest Service. They would always seem to have peyote. And of course, it was never sold. It's like, hey, there's peyote in the duffel bag. Take what you want, hang out for a few days. So when I saw in 1998 an ad for Peyote Way, I had even thought of peyote since 1979. And it was like, oh, shit, I'm going to get in on this. And I did. And, I was part of it from 1998 to 2016, like I said. And the old man died in 2010 of June. He passed on in 2010. But I come to find out that everything I was told about this guy's past is absolutely impossible. I mean, he was supposed to have freed the camps, and the camps were freed in September of 45. And we clearly see a picture of him dated 1947 and 48. I mean, you could go on and on and on. So, if you want to ask some questions and go there, because otherwise I'll just ramble on.
Yeah, well, I just, do you know any other famous people that have been associated with the use of peyote?
No, I know that Leary was supposed to have gotten some from him in 1962, and Allen Ginsberg supposedly wrote some of that awful poem, Howl. It just sounds like a speed freak's rant. It makes no sense. I've read it numerous times over the years, and it just gets shittier every time I read it. They're probably the two biggest ones. Kesey reputedly took peyote on the way back from his New York trip back to the Bay Area, but I don't know. I know that Peter Coyote is an associate member of the church. He actually called one of the co-founders when they were here in my living room to get advice on growing his peyote. It was looking a little peaked. And Bill Walton, the basketball star, is also another member that's not on the official rolls. They got a couple people in Hollywood that are set directors that are members of the church, and there's somebody at Columbia University. I don't know if they're on the board of ethics or on what kind. They're on some kind of a board, and they don't want their name associated with it at all. They don't want anybody to know that they have anything to do with peyote. So, that's most of my experience all came from Native Americans in Arizona, like I said, and one time in Texas. So,
right. So there's a history of the Native Americans using this in a ceremonial fashion?
Oh, yeah. The Native American Church was formed in 1913 by a half-breed Comanche, half white and half Comanche. And what's interesting is most of the Native American Church, for many years, they were all white guys and half-breeds.
And were they using peyote like as an earlier precursor of Peyote Way Church of God?
Supposedly it goes back for several hundred years, but I couldn't find anything before 1840 in my limited experience, just doing internet research. And what I did find was the Apaches originally used it as a poison. They would poison arrows with it through their witch doctor. They didn't take it religiously. I couldn't find any reference that the Mescalero Apaches actually took it religiously. They used it as a poison.
Interesting. So it sounds like this guy Mana basically took the use of peyote having a spiritual component attached to it, and then used that to create a church around it, or was the church really just sort of a cover for a drug trafficking organization?
I think it's a little bit of both. I have an article from the Galveston newspaper in 1987 where his own son says he's not a Native American, he's not an Indian at all, and he took that persona on to sell his pottery. And then the son had to go into hiding because the old man threatened to kill him. And I've got the newspaper article and the DA, the attorney from Texas that was going after them, and they squirted out of that one too. And of course, he won a famous case, the people of the state of Colorado v. Manapardeaton in 1967. He had been busted in 66 at his studio with a large quantity of LSD, hashish, and peyote. And he pled guilty to the peyote and said, I don't know about anything else. It went all the way up through the courts, and he was granted, he was innocent because he was Native American and was using it in a religious fashion.
Wow.
Carl, you said that, Carl, you said that Mano claimed to have liberated the camps. Where was that information presented?
Actually, that was told to me by Matthew, one of the co-founders.
Okay, so it isn't.
He's been busy creating a whole narrative since Immanuel died. He's really been putting stuff out there to just confound the whole thing.
Trying to get a sense about the guy. You say he was basically an operative at some point for the ADL, but that his role was to basically distribute anti-Semitic literature. Can you flesh out what was going on? Was he a double agent working against the ADL, or was he working for the ADL as an agent for them to create anti-Semitism as a tool for their political situation?
I think he ultimately was a communist through his whole life, as he admitted. He said he was a communist for at least 5 years, and that was in 1953. So assuming he got out of the service in 48, he was already a full-blown communist and went to the Jefferson School, which was a communist front. And right after he got out of that, he started these activities in 1952. I think he was probably a triple agent. He was a low-level criminal that had all kinds of different long and short-term scams going on. He had a business selling slugs. He would buy slugs in mass quantities and then distribute them, and was actually making a living doing that, along with the money he was getting from James Sheldon and Sanford Griffith.
Well, how was the ADL controlling him? What was their leverage point? Were they paying him money? Did he have an allegiance to them politically? Why did they have some power over him?
I don't know, but once his scam got exposed, the ADL kind of washed their hands of him and said basically, well, we don't need him anymore. Looking through all the FBI files is quite enlightening. It's just, this guy was all over the place. And pictures, the hand-drawn pictures that I've sent to Ted, you could actually see the name Manna on them. There's pictures of Hitler and German soldiers, and it says, rid America of the goddamn Yid. And it says Manna 53 on there. And it was actually used in the 1954 anti-fascist hate hearings by the Senate. They used his drawings as part of the hearings. And I've linked to that too, the PDF to the trial, to the hearings. And they feature his drawings, and there it is, there's his name. And you could even go to—
Why were they trying to create the impression that there was a bubbling up fascist Hitler worshiping movement in the United States? Because as I went through the documents and listening to you talk now, it seems clear that for some reason they wanted to create that impression. Do you know why they did that, or what Mano had in mind with that activity?
No. I think ultimately it was to bring about the Zionist oligarchical Jewish rule. I really do. See, this stuff, it eventually blends into the psychedelic church he started. And what I have seen going in and out, I was involved with the left and the Grateful Dead, all this shit very deeply for a lot of years. And what I've come to understand is the Grateful Dead psychedelic movement, the reggae movement, and the peyote natural psychedelics movement, there's absolutely no observance or criticism of Israel or Zionism whatsoever. I think it's like a distraction. Everybody's spinning around. We're all one. We're touchstone. It is cosmic consciousness. There is absolutely zero criticism of Israel's war crimes or anything else, or even observing. It's like they don't exist. And I think it's part of this overarching gigantic plot to debase and destroy society. See, one of the co-founders himself told me, he said, Carl, I can't wait till this whole fucking mess is a smoking shithouse and we can start over. Remember, this country was founded on racism and slavery. Well, you know.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the leftist propaganda for you, isn't it? It doesn't sound too different today with the anti-fascist groups of today, which, you know, other research has shown the Antifa be linked to some of the people who are behind NAMBLA, some of the lawyers for NAMBLA operating out of Berkeley. And there certainly does seem to be a tradition of, you know, many of these groups collaborating behind the scenes. I guess the other thing is that in the world of drugs, the manufacturing and cultivation of these psychedelics was not something that was particularly widespread, particularly, you know, back in the 60s or even the 50s. So, you know, there had to be some collusion behind the scenes. But everything that you're saying about this guy, he definitely sounds like an agent of some sort. Do you think that his relationship with the ADL continued right through into the formation of the church?
I wouldn't doubt it. You know, I do know that in the 2000s, an IDF Army guy visited the church for a couple of peyote walks, and he had a very cathartic, extreme experience and went through a lot of guilt over what he was doing to the Palestinians. And a big old pile of peyote live plants went back to Israel with him.
Right.
So
well,
you know,
hopefully that helps the Palestinians.
Yeah, I know, who knows? You know, but I think this is all part of the same game plan. You know, it's just another aspect of it. Oh God, the topic is so huge. You could almost go anywhere with this guy.
What about something that you mentioned to me that is perhaps more speculation than something that you have evidence of? But there's some hints that possibly Mana was an assassin, kind of William S. Burroughs style.
Yeah, he liked to brag, and they all like to drop names, as do I. I love dropping names, and sometimes it's beneficial and sometimes it's not. But I spent 2 days with him, just him and I, out there at the Peyote Ranch. We were the only two there, and did a lot of talking about what we were like, what we're like now, and what happened. And he said, yeah, Carl, you know, if I have a problem, I throw money at a lawyer until he makes it go away. And if the problem is big enough, I put one in the head and one in the chest, and then there's no more problem. You know, and I'm thinking, you know, it goes over my head, right? And then I come to find out in conversation that it's common belief that Immanuel killed 2 Nazis when he infiltrated a Nazi group in the 50s. So I started researching, and the only 2 Nazis I could find that were killed happened in the 1960s. Now, at that time, man was supposed to be traveling around in a van selling pottery with one of his 4 wives. He was married at least 4 times, and he has 6 aliases. So I start comparing things, and John Patler is the man that he's claimed he was a patsy, and he didn't kill George Lincoln Rockwell. But witnesses reported 2 guys running from the scene. Patler was eventually busted, but the FBI says that his footprints do not match the footprints that were on the roof of a laundromat from where they hit Rockwell. Now, I saved 5 instances that say he was hit once in the head and once in the chest from 5 completely separate sources. It's not a cut and paste like UPI gave it to AP or whatever. These are completely different wordings, completely different paragraphs from 5 different sources. And everything says he was hit twice, one in the head and one in the chest. The FBI report says they took 2 bullets out of his body, but the coroner said he was only hit once in the chest. That's very odd. Now, getting back to the people that saw 2 guys running, if you compare pictures of John Patler to some pictures of Immanuel, one can see and say, you know what, if somebody was running and they had an overcoat on, they're about the same size, thick black pompadourish type hair. It's entirely possible. And then when you look and see that John Patler was busted with a German Mauser pistol that had a specific kind of it was called a broom handle, I believe, the stock. that was a German gun. And we know from FBI files, Immanuel was trafficking in German weapons, including knives and swords. The FBI reports are just fascinating with all the shit this guy was pulling. But so Patler said he was a patsy. He's out of jail now. I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he has not talked since he got out of jail. He has been completely tight-lipped. And I got to thinking, it's like, I wonder if this guy was an assassin or if he's just a bullshitter. And it's it could go either way, really.
Right. Well, I find it quite amazing that the Indian guy doing pottery at Millbrook, was a former neo-Nazi arms dealer.
Yeah, and
it's a little odd, isn't it?
I'm sorry, Joe.
I just was agreeing with Steve. I was saying it just seems, illogical that they would have both aspects to his history. So, what's the explanation? It just is artificial. It seems to me.
Well, what else is bizarre is Dan Burrows, I'm sorry. He was a Jewish guy from a rabbinical family that took on the identity of a Nazi. And he was part of the American Nazi Party with George Lincoln Rockwell. He was discovered as being Jewish by a reporter. They blew the whistle on him in an article. And that day, he shot himself in the chest, according to witnesses, then jumped up off the sofa and said, well, this'll do it, and then shot himself in the head. Now, this is by 3 witnesses, right?
Wow.
How does that happen? How do you shoot yourself in the chest and then jump up and shoot yourself in the head?
Yeah, it's certainly starting to look like this guy's a lifetime actor.
Oh, it's just too bizarre, man. And like I said, I couldn't find anything about him being an artist until 1959. And curiously, Mrs. Will Rogers found him his first studio. They supplied to him his first studio, Mr. and Mrs. Will Rogers Jr. in 1959. And I only found one example of him in 59 as an artist and one more in 1960. And then no other mention of him as an artist until 1965. Okay, I'm sorry.
How large do you think that the Peyote Way Church has become? Like, how influential has this person been on society?
The Peyote Way Church is now charging $300 for one experience, and you have to have a 3-month reservation in advance. That's how many people they're packing in there. And, I wasn't expecting to do the church yet. I thought we were going to get into the 50s thing.
Okay, yeah, well, take us back to wherever you'd like to go then, Carl.
The church right now is building their 3rd greenhouse. The original greenhouse is now an entire germination station for seeds, and there's hundreds of thousands of peyote seeds growing, and there's about 50,000 or more peyote plants in another 2 greenhouses. And my family donated $3,000 to the 2nd greenhouse. It's called the grandchildren's greenhouse, and now it's packed with gigantic peyotes. They're the slowest growing cactus. They take 20 years to mature.
Right. So then take us back to the 50s and what Mano was getting up to back then.
Well, basically, he was holding these meetings where he would rant and rage in his apartment, and he was cranking out literature literally by the boxes and sending it throughout Europe. And then there were some Jewish socialites that he threatened, and you could find examples. I don't have them ready to go or anything, but you could find a couple examples of him threatening sexually a woman over supporting the NRP. It's just insane, this guy's rhetoric, and it's all been proven. It's all in all those FBI files. And I needed to apologize. In the 2 things that I had mana files, I made a mistake and double, triple, and even quadruple posted some of the attachments. It got by me, and I apologize. But you could pick any 12 or 15 examples and see he was on those FBI pages as many as 3 times his name. And I come to find out that Eustace Mullins was also part of the NRP, and he was screaming and hollering on street corners for a while there, and then was instructed by somebody to find evidence of homosexual activity against several of the leaders of NRP. So
That's fascinating.
Mullins had
So
directed,
Mullins was a part of this church.
not the church. No, the church didn't get formed till the 70s. This was
Okay,
all
so
the
Mullins was in the, excuse me, go the acronym NRP. That's the National Renaissance.
National Renaissance Party. Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. So that's a kind of a neo-Nazi party.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to lose you guys, so I'm not linking to anything. You know, I'm like in over my head doing this stuff.
No, it's good, really good background information. Everyone should have this, you know, so I'm glad you're bringing it out. I really find it's interesting that there's this artificial anti-Semitism. That's fascinating to me because the last discussion that Steve and I had, we talked about the creation of the Nazi Party. And this was a long process, you know, that was overseen and orchestrated by basically the Theosophical Society, which also produced Krishnamurti and that branch of kind of mysticism. And this thing called the Quattro Coronati, which was, you know, the Freemason Research Lodge of Britain. And among so they produced, the Quattro Coronati produced Helen Blavatsky, who then, you know, started this process whereby the Nazi Party comes into existence. But they also created Aleister Crowley. I mean, he, you know, it's a stretch to say they created him, but he certainly was influenced by them, funded by him, and supported by them. So, and you can really see the relationship between Crowley and the Quattro Coronati when you look into the mysticism that the Quattro Coronati was developing. This thing, Memphis and Mizram, which then Crowley picks up and becomes Thelema. So you can see that, you know, for some reason, this small circle of British Freemason and Jewish banking families, you know, got these things going. And one of the aspects of it was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, you know, we now see as a fraud, but in the 20s was very influential in animating anti-Semitism, which was very useful for these people in terms of the creation of Israel. They had in mind that the Jews would have a reason to leave Europe. And so they created anti-Semitism, Theodor Herzl, and working with these guys in the Quattro Coronati. But they actually then produced this, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so you have, in that instance, the creation, an artificial creation of anti-Semitism for a very specific political purpose. And then you talk about this, so that's very general, right? General historical principle. And then you bring in this very specific detail, which seems to mirror this use of anti-Semitism for a political purpose. So I found that was fascinating that, you know, the ADL was linked up to this guy who then is a very direct relationship connection into the Millbrook Mansion. And then from there into the Grateful Dead, into, you know, the acid test and the whole counterculture. It's fascinating because it's all, it's just it's so logical, you know, that it's very, once you get the right kind of, you know, sense about the whole thing, this Mano character, and incidentally, I did read the links that you sent. They were fascinating. This guy is, you know, really deserves a lot of study. People should be aware of him because he's like you say, he's someone that you can really use to expose what's in back of, you know, our counterculture. So anyway, I didn't mean to digress too far, but I wanted just to point out how interesting it is that these general principles then have specific parallels that are really clear, and you can see that, you know, it worked in terms of World War II and the destruction of the Europeans and the creation of the State of Israel. And then here we are again in 1948 through 50 and going into the 60s, and it's working again. You know, the ADL is there with an artificial creation of anti-Semitism that then creates the political conditions whereby their power becomes increased.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Also, I'd point people to my last episode, CryptoBeast 14, which I just recorded with David Livingston, and we explored the same theme again, that this is basically these people were followers of Hegel. You know, it's create the synthesis and the antithesis at the same time, and that's the strategy that we see playing out. So let's move back to the 50s. And Carl, you mentioned the French super spy, Sanford Griffith, was it?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about that character and how he connects to Mana?
He was huge in espionage and propaganda during World War II. And then I guess, I don't know if he started the non-sectarian anti-Nazi League or if it was already formed, but he was the bankroll behind that. He was funneling money down along with James Sheldon from the ADL, and Trujillo was getting that money.
And he was using the money to disseminate propaganda and to basically, you know, host almost like it's not quite a town hall meeting. It's a cross between a literary salon and a town hall meeting. It's like, come around to my apartment and, you know, I'll tell you all my wild and crazy views. And,
you know, young girls in front of you.
Right.
So Mana knew, Mana.
Hey, you guys.
Did he know members of the Grateful Dead?
He claims to have met Pigpen, but what did happen in 1980 when they first met Bill Walton, the basketball star, who we all know is a massive deadhead, the pottery company made like a dozen ceramic skulls. I have shared a picture of mine, I think. I've got one. But they made a whole line of psychedelic skulls for everybody in the top line of the Grateful Dead, a couple of the roadies and the whole band. And one or two of these skulls are shown in their 1980s videos. It's a quick, you know, it's a quick montage thing during some psychedelic segment. But you know, I don't know if he met Pigpen or not, but they do have a connection with the dead. And as I told Steve, when Mana was planted on the land in 2010, Peggy showed up and she left a $5,000 donation on the table.
It's Peggy Mellon Hitchcock.
Yeah, after she paid her respects. And Immanuel had, for his whole life, he was friends with Rosemary Leary, and he kept a personal letter from her in a frame on his desk in his bedroom. And I also, you guys might find this interesting, but myself and my son visited Immanuel many times in his bedroom over the years. He was sequestered to his room for the last like 10 years because of illness and shit. But on his wall in the 2000s, he had an SS flag on one wall and a National Socialist flag on the other, and he had a drawer full of German marks. So he was still at least romancing this kind of stuff. It's like, why does this 80-year-old man have an SS flag on one wall and the red, black, and white National Socialist flag on the other? And of course, you know, you're polite. You don't just start taking pictures of shit when you're friends with people. You know, I try to have some kind of civility. And I just thought he was a crazy old World War II vet, you know, before I found all this stuff out.
That's interesting. Do you know if he had any interest at all in the Theosophical Society?
I don't know. He never really spoke of anything like that. He basically would, if you talk to him, if you know anything about Captain Beefheart, he sounded like Captain Beefheart on acid. He had this beatnik, crazy way of talking with cultural references, and he really liked to come off as that fine line between genius and insanity. He kind of played that. He was very interesting to talk to, but he did not pull any punches. He hated fat people. He hated people that were lazy. You couldn't have a chair unless you worked. They didn't recognize birthdays because that's ego. They actually gave Jimmy Carter a peyote button, and Richard Nixon and the Goldwater family are celebrity collectors of his pottery. And Barry Goldwater sponsored him by selling his whole line of pottery all the way through the 50s up to the present, till the Goldwater store went out of business. They featured Man of Pottery. And
Wow.
Richard Nixon was a collector too. He has a bunch of art out at San Clemente from Immanuel.
It's amazing to think of Richard Nixon dropping peyote and
Peyote art, I know.
collecting psychedelic pottery.
Yeah. And Yoko Ono's got a live plant too. When John was murdered, they had sent a condolence card to Yoko along with a peyote plant. And this gets into some other things that we're not going to talk about right now, but in the mid-2000s, Yoko still had that plant on her bookcase over there in Dakota. And I think I shared an attachment from 2014 Earth Day that had Annie, Matthew, and Yoko with love. I think I sent it, I PM'd it to you, but you know, there's a whole other area going on here. We could get into organ trafficking and pineal glands and the child porn. There's a whole bunch of stuff to get into with this guy in that church that will just confuse things right now. That's why it's got to be done right from the beginning, and we segue, you know, if we want to really get deep into this. I've got a lot more stuff from the 50s. Basically, they're news articles describing the different trials of the NRP, and he's mentioned in everything, every news article he's mentioned in. And then for some reason in 1950...
So was he presenting himself as a Native American back then?
Well, you know what's funny is you could go through all the different accounts. In some accounts, he's a quarter breed. In some accounts, he's a half breed. And in other accounts, he's a full-blooded Apache. You can't be all three. And you could actually see this not only with the interviews over the years, but in his own descriptions of himself from the 50s onward. It's like, you want to pick a fucking bloodline here, man? You know, a quantity? It can't be true. And if you know anything about peyote and the experience, there is no way you're going to eat peyote and then start riots and do anti-Semitic literature and start busting shit up. It just doesn't happen. It cannot happen. I don't believe he had any peyote until years later. I can't see it. You know, and then they claim that, well, he was a British merchant marine and got blown up at the island of Heligoland and had to be repaired, recovered at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. And then for some reason, he joined the U.S. Army and they hired him to train Army Rangers. Why would the U.S. Army hire a 5'8" guy, 5'4" guy with all these traumatic brain injuries and massive blackouts and a plate in his head to train U.S. Army Rangers? That makes no sense. No sense. And then he was supposed to be a stunt double for Charles Bronson and all this shit in his Hollywood years. It's a complete fiction. It cannot all be true.
Coming back
of the lifetime actors pretending to be a psychedelic drug taker is a common theme. I don't know if you've ever seen there's a video that's on YouTube about Ken Kesey's LSD test at the hospital. Have you ever watched that? But it's an obvious fiction. They've even got like the all-seeing eye of Horus in the ceiling, and then he's told that he can turn the tape recorder off and on. So it's clearly just a production. But I think that even people that were, you know, famous for drug use, like McKenna and Leary and Kesey, once you sort of recognize that the oligarchs were using the drugs for malevolent purposes, that they thought they could basically, you know, negatively affect the minds of their subjects, then you can, you know, at least come up with a question like, did they ever take drugs? Was this just an act, part of their presentation to the public of being stoned, to give the impression that everyone's doing it? And you know, to support that idea is the fact that they would know how dangerous the drugs are. So why would they take them? You know, that's why when you talk about Manu not, pretending to take them and not taking them, perhaps not taking them, it rings a bell with me. It resonates. That'd be kind of something I'd like to know the truth about.
Oh, I'm sure he took psychedelics. He's a lifelong fan of them. When he was home. No, these guys, he sounds like a lifetime actor too. I would like to know.
Are you guys hearing an echo there?
Pardon me?
There's a little bit of an echo.
The audio is really crisp and clear at this end.
Okay. So we'll just try again. So go ahead, Carl.
I've come to the conclusion that he's probably a lifetime actor and may have been programmed when he was in prison up in Canada. Because, like I said, there's no mention of him as an artist. And all of a sudden he gets out of prison, and the next thing you know, he's married to an Indian woman from Canada yet. And all of a sudden he's an artist. And I showed that 1968 Smithsonian Indian Artists book with you. And all these Indian artists, their resumes, their military service, where they went to school, there's absolutely nothing about Mana. It says Mana Apache. And then a couple pages later is his wife, Rena Paradas, and she's got like a giant paragraph of her resume, basically, her education, where she went to school, her Indian. So I think he tagged onto her and took on like that personality, or was programmed. And I don't know who the doctor was that was running the prison up there, but I mean, wasn't there you and Cameron or somebody running those prisons and the hospitals in Canada?
Yeah, there was definitely a number of different Canadian facilities participating in MK Ultra.
Yeah.
And you know what's curious too?
Yeah.
The Dr. Lewis Jolly West quote about the psychedelic communities in the desert, that fits Peyote way perfectly, that quote. They're sequestered out in the desert. They're taking massive amounts of peyote, and LSD finds its way out there, and so does mushrooms. And it's like, you can hang out. Nudity is, you want to be naked and hang out for 5 days tripping on peyote, that's fine. They're left undisturbed. As a matter of fact, they're surrounded by an Indian reservation and what used to be a sheriff. He had a ranch next door to them. They were completely sequestered out there, and it's all Mormon country, and most of the people are either failed cattle ranchers or they're prison guards, because there's like 5 prisons in the area down there. And they've never been raided. Nobody's been busted coming or going out of there. I mean, it's tolerated. Like Jolly West says, these psychedelic communes are tolerated, and most of the membership are white men. You get these guys that are drug takers, psychedelic drug takers, and they find a quasi-legal way to do it, and most of them are white men. Again, it's like they're basically taking you away from your culture, your family, and your religion, and replacing it with this false Native American spirituality that was completely created. Like I said, I've had peyote for years. I had it before the co-founders of the church did, not Immanuel, but the other 2 co-founders. So I had a big experience with that for years. So it was kind of interesting to see their spin on it. And again, there's much more.
It is interesting because, at least for my research, I think you can trace the development of, metaphysics and kind of Gnostic spiritualism into this group of elites in the 19th century, mid-19th century. They come up with Isis cults, astrology, which had been dead. They come up with, one of the examples is Memphis and Mizram. They didn't have access to drugs, but they were definitely trying to affect the minds of the people that they could draw into their organizations. And the idea is, of course, as they were moving forward, is they wanted the occultism that was then useful for the creation of the Nazi Party. I mean, remember, the Nazis were a mystic religious group. Think about, the Aryan supremacy, and even the swastika is, a very esoteric symbol. It's Masonic, it's angled 45 degrees. Blavatsky had developed the concept of the world teacher, And on one hand, you had Krishnamurti, but on the other, you know, you've got Sabbatendorf producing Adolf Hitler. So mysticism was an important part of how they were going to bamboozle the minds of the public. And so when you then trace mysticism into the psychedelic drug use, in other words, you see that the same group is then, you know, putting on the acid tests, the Grateful Dead, right? Suddenly, they don't even need the intellectualization of mysticism. They've got it in a capsule. And so now they can promote mysticism and drug use simultaneously. One, you know, supports the other. And so it seems to me that you've you know, are showing pretty clearly that that the peyote movement was maybe not have been directly controlled by, but was certainly influenced by the you know, the oligarch organization, the secret society, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that you mentioned the swastika, because the first time I met Manna I was outside and I had my shirt off, and he walked up to me and shook my hand, and he looked me up and down and said, "Well, I know you're not a racist. You're not wearing any swastikas." And I'm thinking, God damn, these World War II guys are weird, man. You know.
Yeah.
So tell us about Samuel Roth and how he connects to Manna.
Samuel Roth was a pornographer that spent a lot of the last years of his life in prison. Some of our earliest modern porn laws came from his case. Samuel Roth, he published a lot of different pornography and was busted and raided a few times. He was Lower East Side of New York, of course, connected to Columbia University. In 1955, he published Immanuel's book under the imprint name Andre Levy. If one looks up Samuel Roth's wiki and then you go down to the imprint name, you'll see Andre Levy, 1955. And we compare that to the inside of Immanuel's book, and it's Andre Levy Publishers, 1955. So Samuel Roth published that. Let's see here. That Andre Levy is an imprint name for Samuel Roth. He was busted many times, like I said. And curiously enough, this guy cashed in twice. He also printed Pat Ward's book. She was the socialite prostitute that was involved with Mickey Jelke, the oleo heir, who got busted for pimping and pandering and all kinds of nonsense. Manuel was basically the star witness in his second trial.
You know, an unknown area, right? These are areas that really haven't been covered by even like the researchers into the counterculture, right? They just haven't got into it yet. So this is brand new. So we've got to start out laying out the groundwork. And I think that Manu is a great place to start, because he's such a, he's the key to understanding the whole thing, I would suspect. You've got so much documentation on him. I mean, who was he? How was he managed? What did he really believe? You know, what was his purpose? It would be great to really get to the bottom of that guy.
And the curious thing, as I can show and absolutely prove later on, is their connections to the Mormon Church.
Yeah.
And then what I can't prove is Matthew bragging that his father, or not his father, his brother is a Freemason, and his other brother is Army intelligence. He loves telling people those two things.
It's the same thing.
Yeah,
so
there we go again. Actually, it's interesting that you bring up the Mormons, because this week I was watching a new Vice documentary called The Mexican Mormon War that I found to be absolutely fascinating. And I guess there was a schism within the Mormon Church over polygamy. And the ones that mostly stayed in the US said, we don't want it. And so as a result, those who wanted to have two or more wives went down south to Mexico to set up colonies. And these colonies are now completely surrounded by drug cartels, and the Mormons are forced to fight back. And, you know, apparently guns aren't allowed within their religion until it comes to a matter of self-defense of the family. And they were showing compounds down there that are basically laid out the same way that US military bases are in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Good heavens. Wow.
So I guess the part of the idea is that within that culture of Mormonism, they do support the idea of colonies, and that within the colony, whatever goes on that's up to them. Just leave them alone within their own space. And you can see how that does fit in with the psychedelic culture and the hippie communes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Guys, I have to go. I hope you guys can continue on. I'll definitely be available for the next meeting. And I haven't quite finished reading. Carl, you sent so many links. I've been plowing through them as fast as I can, but I want to get through every single one of them. And if you have more, I also would hope that you would, share with Steve and myself all of that material. It's so important, and it's just a lot of work to get through, but we need to synthesize it into a nice little tidy package so that we can distribute it to the public, so that we can have a nice, simple, easy to understand plank or platform part of the creation of the whole counterculture. I just think that when I was going through the material, I was trying, my mind was kind of like having ideas on how to do that. How to synthesize all that down into like 2 or 3 pages. That's gonna be a lot of work, but boy, oh boy, I think it's something we really should think about trying to do.
Yeah, I'm perfectly willing to. I try to only talk about what I know and what I can prove. And for the last 3 years, I've been laying down a solid base to establish credibility by personal pictures, notarized things. I've posted on several Facebook forums. I wanted a solid base where people go, this guy was there, he was part of it, we've seen all his documentation and personal photos, because the stuff I'm trying to get at is the end of this friggin' tale. And I have to keep starting at the beginning with the new people,
Well, that's the problem we all have. And when you're dealing with secret societies and spooks, those origins are always hidden. You pick up a thread here and a connection there, and a logic, bit enables you to understand this connection. But the origins are always a mist. And then as you start to work the research, you can get into a rhythm and sort of understand everything. I do a show with a guy, and he talks about it as the whole thing is a schematic. In other words, we have the history that has been given to us for mind control, but now independent researchers have to basically replace all of it, every little bit of it, to create the real history of our experience, so that we have an understanding of where we stand.
Yeah.
And this, what you're talking about.
Thanks very much, Joe. And to your point about the volume of information, I will be compiling a lot of the documents and the photographs and the links that Carl has shared with us at burners.me, my blog. So if you're watching this on video, go over to burners.me and search for Mana, the man and the mystery. Carl, was there anything else that you wanted to cover in relation to Mana in the 50s?
I've got a lot of newspaper articles that I collected from newspapers.com. I have a subscription, and I found a ton of stuff basically dealing with the NRP, like I said. But what I found curious was in 1955, when his book came out, it was announced in multiple cities throughout the U.S., and I have some of the announcements. It's like people in Beebeetown, Iowa, don't know who Mana Trujillo is, and Pat Ward. I found it curious that his book was being pushed in multiple newspapers around the United States.
It's a dead giveaway. That's a dead giveaway that this is a character they're putting into motion and culture for a purpose.
Yeah, so I've got these articles too, right off the news, and it's like, why would they advertise this guy's book? Nobody friggin' heard of this guy outside of New York.
I'm just reminded of, maybe triggered is the right word, of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Wasn't there like a tall Indian character? It was one of the characters.
Yeah.
I wonder if Mana was the inspiration there.
Yeah, I wonder too. So,
Carl, it's a pleasure meeting you. I got to run. I actually have another, with my wife, believe it or not, we have a social engagement. I can't really get out of this one.
Well, thanks for stopping in, Joe. I appreciate it.
January down in Auckland. Hope you'll be there when I come down. And Carl,
yeah, fantastic. I'd love to.
On the next show.
Thank you, Joe. Thank
All
you.
right, guys. Talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Okay, Cal, is there anything else that you'd like to cover about the 50s?
No, I guess not. You know, like I said, most of it's just newspaper articles and stuff, and you know.
Okay, well, I think that's a good point to wrap it up then, and then we'll get as many of the newspaper articles and everything as we can up on a blog post, so if people are more interested, they can, you know, go through that material themselves. Well, thanks very much for coming on here and starting to share your story and to fill us in about Mana. I think, as Joe said, this is a significant part of the evolution of the entire counterculture and the drugs and psychedelic movement, and it's a story that hasn't really been told. And you know, looking at this guy's activities with the ADL and promoting anti-Semitism, and you know, his weapons dealing, his involvement, as you've said, is and you know, possibly child trafficking, child porn, compromise operations, and things like that. It's looking more and more like he must have been some sort of agent. Well, no wonder then that they don't want us to know about him. But,
yeah, there's so much to get into in the 70s and beyond, you know. And then if we get around to covering that, then we could actually talk about things that were told to me and anecdotal conversations and what's really going on behind the scenes. And then there's always the Smithsonian fraud. That's a complete fraud, that American Indian collection. They never verified that he was an Indian. And I have my emails with the curator there, and I asked her how that collection was verified. And that's some pretty interesting email exchanges. And I did Golden Research Military too, and they don't know anything about Immanuel because I don't have the right kind. I don't know what his unit number was. But everything I could give them, they said, we can't find anything. They searched for 4 months, didn't even come up with his name.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, I look forward to getting into that in some future episodes with you. Thank you very much, Carl Hassell, and thanks everybody for tuning in.